My wife looked at me in our new apartment and said, "Maybe I settled too early in life." I didn't argue. I quietly signed the transfer papers for my overseas position, packed my bags, and months later her messages arrived wondering why silence felt larger than regret. "Maybe I settled too early in life." She said it quietly, not in the middle of a fight, not after a slammed door or a screaming match that had been building for weeks. She said it standing in front of our living room window, with a glass of wine in her hand and the city lights flickering outside in the dark below us. In the apartment we had moved into 3 days ago. The apartment we had spent 4 separate weekends choosing. The apartment I had stretched my budget for because she had stood in that exact spot during the viewing and said she loved the way the lights looked at night. She didn't look at me when she said it. She just stared at the glass in her hand, swirled it once, and let those words fall out of her mouth like she had been holding them quietly for a long time and had suddenly, finally, gotten tired of the effort. I didn't say anything. I just stood there in the kitchen doorway, still holding the dish towel I'd been using to dry the plates we'd just unpacked together, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not break, not shatter, shift, like a wall that doesn't collapse all at once, but slowly, quietly, leans a degree too far, and you just know, that the rest is only a matter of time now. All the weight of what comes next already visible in that single, barely perceptible lean. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. I was 34. She was 32. We had been married for 4 years, together for 6. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner on a Friday night that had started as an obligation for both of us. We laughed too loud at the same joke, caught each other laughing, and spent the next 3 hours at the end of the bar talking like the rest of the table had ceased to exist entirely. I walked her to the cab line at midnight. She gave me her number without me having to ask for it. I thought I was the luckiest man in the room that night. For a long time, I still did. I didn't respond to what she said at the window. Not that night. Not because I didn't have words. I had too many, too tangled, moving too fast to trust any of them. But because I understood, in that very moment, that some conversations are not really conversations. Some conversations are confessions. And the person making the confession isn't looking for a debate. They're testing the temperature of the room. Looking for a reaction that tells them how much power they still have. Looking for you to panic, to reach, to say, "No, no, that's not true. Let me convince you otherwise." I wasn't going to give her that. Not because I was cold, but because something in me recognized the moment for what it was, and it was not a moment for begging. I folded the dish towel carefully over the oven handle, walked to the couch, sat down, picked up my book, and read exactly 0 words on the page for the next hour and 15 minutes while she finished her wine and eventually disappeared into the bedroom without saying anything else. I lay awake until just past 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling. Not crying, not raging, just thinking. And somewhere in the quiet, still back of my mind, a decision was beginning to form. Small at first, the way all significant decisions start, not as a full thing, but as a feeling, a direction, a door you can just barely see from where you're standing, and you don't know yet whether you're going to walk toward it or away from it, but you know it's there now. You can't unknow it. The overseas position had been sitting in my email for 11 days at that point. My company's regional office in Zurich. A 2-year contract, senior director level, meaningful salary increase, full relocation package. My manager, Dale, a direct, no-nonsense man who expressed appreciation almost exclusively through professional opportunities rather than words, had flagged it to me personally. He said I was the strongest internal candidate. He said this was the kind of role that defined careers. He said I should take my time thinking about it, but not too much time. I had read the email 4 times in the first 24 hours. Then I had archived it. Because Claire and I had just signed the lease on the new apartment. Because Claire had just been talking about the next chapter of our life. Because I thought we were fine. I thought we were settled and moving forward and occasionally distant in the way that busy people and long relationships get distant. But fundamentally, underneath it, fine. We were not fine. I understand that clearly now. I had been performing the role of a man who believed everything was fine while the woman sitting across from him at dinner had been quietly, slowly, stepping back from the center of a life she was no longer certain she wanted. I don't say that with bitterness. I've worked at that and I mean it. I say it because it is simply, accurately what was happening. And I had been too committed to the idea of us, to the identity of being in this marriage, building this life, being this particular version of myself, to see it for what it was. We do that. People do that. We hold the story we want so tightly that we mistake it for the truth. 2 days after the window comment, I came home to find her on the phone in the bedroom. She didn't hear the front door. I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally. I walked through to put groceries down on the kitchen counter and caught fragments of the conversation through the half-open door, carried to me by the casual physics of sound in a small apartment. I don't know, Brooke. It's like sometimes I feel like I made all my decisions too fast, you know? A pause. No, it's not like that. He's a good person. He's genuinely a really good person. That's not what I'm saying. A longer pause. The point is I don't know if good was supposed to be enough for me. I don't know if I ever asked myself the right questions before I said yes to all of it. I set the grocery bags down on the counter. Very slowly. Very deliberately. The way you move when you need to stay quiet, but your whole body is responding to something at once. I stood there for exactly 10 seconds. Then I quietly walked back out of the apartment, sat down in the hallway with my back against the wall between our door and the neighbors, and I breathed. Long and slow. The hallway smelled like old carpet and someone's dinner from 2 floors up. I had married a woman who loved me. Past tense now, apparently. Or at minimum, a woman who was actively reevaluating whether the version of love she felt for me was the version she actually wanted. And there it was, laid out in language I couldn't argue against because it hadn't been said to me. It had been said around me. The kind of honesty people only produce when they think they're not being heard. Her name was Claire. She was brilliant. Not the flattering, reflexive kind of brilliant that people call attractive partners just because. Genuinely, thoroughly brilliant in ways that had nothing to do with how I felt about her. She had a master's in urban planning, a laugh that physically shifted the atmosphere of whatever room she was in, and a rare, specific talent for making strangers feel like people she had known for years within the first 10 minutes of conversation. When we met, I remember thinking, this woman is going to leave every room better than she found it, and I want to be someone she comes back to at the end of the day. I got that for a long time. I had been grateful for it. I had also done everything in my power to deserve it. I showed up. I adjusted. I built myself around her schedule when hers was busier than mine. I drove her to interviews, stayed up late listening to project anxieties, cooked dinner on the nights she came home too depleted to think about food. Not because I was keeping score. Not because I expected reciprocation as a transaction. Because I loved her, and the natural expression of loving someone is making space for the things they need. What I hadn't fully accounted for was the slow, quiet way she had stopped doing the same. Not dramatically. Not cruelly. Not in any one identifiable moment. Just incrementally. The way water recedes from a shoreline so gradually that you don't notice the change until the day you realize the tide has been low for weeks and the sand has been dry for longer than you remember. I had been standing on that dry sand pretending the tide would return. It wasn't coming back. I understood that now, sitting on a hallway floor breathing in someone else's dinner smells, with a clarity I didn't know how to carry and nowhere to put it down. That night, after she got off the phone, we had dinner together. She was lighter, like talking to Brooke had released some internal pressure that had been building and building. She talked about a project meeting. Something contentious at work. A colleague whose entire approach she fundamentally disagreed with. I listened. I asked the right questions. I said the right things in the right places. And the entire time, underneath the practiced performance of a normal Tuesday evening dinner, I was thinking about the email from Dale. Zurich. 2 years. A completely different life. One that I had almost not considered, had almost clicked away from entirely, because I had been so busy trying to hold the current one together with both hands. She refilled her glass. You seem quiet, she said. Not unkindly. She noticed things, Claire. That had always been one of the things about her. Just tired, I said. She nodded and went back to her pasta. That was the whole exchange. That was most of our exchanges now. Short, polite, carefully bounded. 2 people being exquisitely courteous to each other across a gap that was widening in plain sight, while both of us kept our eyes deliberately to the side of it. That weekend I drove out to see Conrad. He had been my closest friend since we were 20 years old at university, which gave him a specific kind of access to me that very few people have. The kind earned through years and shared embarrassments and all the many versions of yourself you've been that you'd never showed to someone you met as an adult. I told him what Claire had said at the window. I told him what I'd overheard. He didn't respond immediately. He poured 2 glasses of his objectively terrible homemade whiskey. something he'd been attempting and failing to perfect for 3 years now, handed me one, and let the silence do its necessary, working thing. Eventually he said, "What do you want to do?" Not, "Here's what I think you should do." Not, "Have you considered this angle?" Just, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to stop feeling like a consolation prize in my own marriage." He nodded like that was both the most understandable and most overdue thing he'd ever heard me say. "So stop," he said. Simple. Absolutely brutal. Completely necessary. I drove home in the dark thinking about Zurich. About what it meant to want something for yourself rather than fitting yourself carefully around what someone else wanted. About what it would feel like to start somewhere clean. About the specific, quiet luxury of a life that had your name on it because you chose it and not because it was the shape that happened to be available when you stopped moving. I opened the email on Sunday morning while Claire was still asleep. Senior Director of Operations, EMEA Division. Zurich, Switzerland. 2-year initial contract with extension options. Housing allowance, quarterly travel benefits, a salary that would have seemed like a reward for someone who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. I read every word, every attached document. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold beside me, and I asked myself a question I had been stepping carefully around for days. If I were not married, if I had zero reason to stay for someone else's sake, would I take this? The answer arrived before the question had fully finished forming. Yes. Immediate, uncomplicated, clean yes. And then I asked myself the harder thing. Was I staying because I genuinely wanted to stay? Or was I staying because leaving meant admitting that the thing I had built, the life I had structured my entire adult decade around, was no longer what I thought it was? And was what I had built even still standing? Or had I been conducting my daily life inside a structure that had been quietly crumbling at its foundations for longer than I was willing to measure? I sat with those questions for a long time. The coffee went cold. The morning light moved slowly across the kitchen floor. I didn't move. I called Dale on Monday morning. Told him I was still interested. He sounded genuinely pleased, the closest thing to enthusiasm his professional vocabulary typically allowed. He said the final decision needed to be made within 3 weeks, that HR would handle the relocation documents, and that he was confident this was going to be exactly the right move for where my career was going. I thanked him, hung up, and then closed my office door and sat completely still for about 20 minutes. I had not told Claire about the position. I want to explain that clearly because it matters. I hadn't told her because 11 days ago, when the email arrived, I had been completely certain I was going to decline it. Because we had just signed a lease. Because she had been talking about next chapters. Because I believed we were fine. The not telling was not strategy. It was the specific carelessness of a man who thought there was nothing to decide. And now there was everything to decide. And I was deciding. Things at home continued their pattern in the days that followed. Surface level normal. Breakfast together on the mornings, our schedules aligned. Evenings watching something neither of us was fully watching. Conversation that moved carefully along the surface of things without going underneath. It had been like this for a while, I knew now. I had just been filing it under the wrong category. I had been labeling it as a rough patch, a busy season, a natural lull that would eventually break open into ease again. I was not in a rough patch. I was in the final months of something that had been winding down so slowly and so quietly that I had managed not to see it head on. Then one Tuesday evening, Claire came home energized in a way I hadn't seen from her in a while. She'd run into an old university friend at a networking event. His name was Wesley. She mentioned him once in the first telling of the story, then again as an aside while connecting it to something else, then a third time at dinner when she brought up a mutual college acquaintance they had both run into. I didn't react. I asked the neutral, supportive questions. I was polite and present and listened without giving any outward indication that I had carefully cataloged each mention. But later, I noticed she had followed him on social media. His profile was public, and I looked at it for exactly 4 seconds before I closed the app and put my phone face down on the table. I was not going to spiral into speculation about what it did or didn't mean, but I kept it as information. Another quiet data point added to a picture that was becoming increasingly, unmistakably legible. The following Friday, she was dressed to go out when I got home. Brooke's birthday dinner. She might have told me the week before. I genuinely wasn't sure. She was gone by 7. I ordered food, ate at the kitchen table alone, and then did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I went to the second bedroom, the one we called the study but was mostly used for things that hadn't found a permanent home, and I sat at the desk and opened a notebook. Not to write a letter, Not to construct a decision document. Not to build an argument. Just to think on paper, the way you do when the inside of your own head has gotten too full and too tangled to sort anything clearly. I wrote for nearly 3 hours. About what I wanted for my life. About the last time I had felt genuinely, uncomplicated excited about waking up in the morning. About whether the life I was currently living was one I had chosen with my full self or one I had allowed to form around me, because the shape was comfortable enough that I never paused to ask if it was mine. About all the small adjustments I had made over 6 years, willingly, without bitterness, because loving someone means making room for the things they need. And about whether any of those adjustments had been met in kind, in the quiet daily ways that don't announce themselves, but that tell you everything. About the window. About the phone call. About the words settled in her mouth, quiet and certain, in the apartment she had picked for the view. I wrote until my hand was tired and the room had gone dark, and I could hear the city doing its late-night things outside. Claire came home around midnight. I was already in bed by then. She moved quietly through the room so as not to disturb what she believed was a sleeping version of me. That small, thoughtful gesture almost completely undid me. Because she was still considerate. She was still, in all the small daily ways, a fundamentally good person. She just didn't want to be my person anymore. And there is a very particular kind of pain in being left by someone who is still genuinely, observably good. It would be easier if there were cruelty involved. If they gave you something hard to hold, something to push against. But when the person is kind and thoughtful and considerate, and simply, clearly, no longer choosing you, you have nothing to push against. You're just standing in the rain with your hands open and nowhere to put all of it. 2 weeks after the night at the window, I completed the transfer paperwork for the Zurich position. I did it on a Tuesday afternoon with my office door closed and my phone placed face down on the far corner of the desk. Name, current position, department, receiving office, proposed start date. I signed at the bottom, initialed where required, scanned everything neatly, sent it to Dale's assistant with a brief, professional note. And then I sat in the quiet of my office for a while, not devastated, not triumphant, not performing anything for any audience, real or imagined, just clear. Specifically, unexpectedly, completely clear. The first time I had felt that way in months. Maybe longer. I told Conrad before I told Claire. He was quiet for a moment when I said it was done. Then, when do you leave? I said, about 6 weeks. He said, does she know? I said, not yet. He said, when are you going to tell her? I looked at my hands for a moment. Soon, I said. Don't wait too long, he said. Not as judgment. Just as a practical observation from a man who has always known the difference between the two. I waited 5 more days before I told her. Not strategically, not to accumulate some kind of advantage. I waited because I needed to be completely certain, not of the decision, I was settled on that, but of the delivery. I had watched this marriage conduct itself without drama for years. 2 people being careful and civil and considerate even when things beneath the surface were not right. I was not going to let the ending be what the marriage hadn't been. I was not going to make a scene. I was going to be honest, and I was going to be calm, and I was going to say what I had to say without performance or pointed cruelty. I told her on a Wednesday evening. She had cooked, which was unusual lately, something simple, chicken with rice, the kind of meal that communicates effort without announcing it. I appreciated it. We ate. She talked about a city council dispute that had derailed a project she'd been working on for months. I listened. I asked about it. The food was genuinely good. When we were both done and the plates were cleared and she was filling the kettle at the sink, I said it. I accepted the Zurich position. She turned around slowly. What Zurich position? My company's been trying to fill a senior director role in the European division. Dale flagged it to me about a month ago. I said yes. I signed the paperwork 2 weeks ago. She stared at me. 2 weeks ago. Not a question. The beginning of something else. Yes, I said. And you're telling me now? Yes, I said again. Why didn't you tell me when you were considering it? I looked at her directly, steadily, because I wasn't considering it. And then I was. And by the time I was, it was already decided. You don't make a decision like that without talking to your wife. You just don't. She stopped. Claire, I said. Just her name. She stopped. Something in how I said it, probably. The absence of apology in it. The particular quality of a man who has finished arguing about something internally and no longer needs to argue about it externally. Maybe I settled too early in life, I said. Very quietly. No sharpness in it. Just the words, return to her. I watched her face change completely. She remembered exactly when she had said it, and where she had been standing, and what the wine glass had felt like in her hand, and the way the city lights had looked while she said it. She opened her mouth, closed it. "That's not fair," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm not trying to be fair. I'm trying to be honest. I heard what you said that night. I heard the phone call with Brooke. I've been listening to this for a while, Claire. I just didn't want to believe it because I was still trying to hold together something that had already, quietly, let go of me." She sat down slowly. The kettle was beginning to hiss behind her. "I didn't mean it the way it came out," she said. "I think you meant it more than you knew," I said. "And I think that's the truth, not an attack. People don't say things like that by accident. Not in quiet moments. Not in their own voices without any heat behind them." The silence between us was different now. Not the practiced, careful silence of two people maintaining a diplomatic distance. This was the silence of something finally being named out loud after a long time of both of us walking carefully around it in the dark. She cried. Not dramatically, just quietly, in the way people do when they've been caught mid-process in something they hadn't realized they were doing until someone else named it clearly. She said she'd been going through something. She said she felt restless and unmoored, and that it wasn't about me specifically. It was more about her, about the age she was and the choices she had or hadn't made, and all the roads she sometimes found herself wondering about. I believed her. I want to be clear about that. I genuinely believed her, because I think she was telling the truth. And I also think the truth is that when a person in your marriage is restless about their choices and looking down roads they didn't take and wondering if they chose too quickly, you are never entirely outside that accounting. Not as the villain, not as the specific cause, but as part of the landscape of the life they're questioning. I didn't say that. I said, "I believe you, and I want you to know I'm not doing this as a punishment." "Then why?" she asked. "Because I think we've been not quite right for a while now," I said. "And I think part of you knows that. And I think keeping ourselves in this apartment, in this city, in this version of things, out of inertia or habit, or because leaving is logistically complicated, I don't think that helps either of us." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I didn't want it to end," she said. "I know," I said. "Neither did I." And that was true. Both things were true at the same time. That's the part of endings that people don't talk about enough. How they can be right and still hurt, necessary and still constitute a real loss, clean and still cost you something genuine that you cannot get back. The weeks that followed were strange. Not cold or hostile or ugly, but undeniably, quietly, irreversibly final. We had a few more real conversations in the time before I left. She asked, once, if I wanted to try counseling. I sat with the question seriously before I answered. Then I said, "I think we're past the point where a counselor could fix what's actually wrong." She didn't argue with that, because she knew, in the same quiet way I knew, that what was wrong wasn't a communication problem or a recurring conflict or a specific wound that could be carefully addressed and healed over time. What was wrong was that we had grown, over time and without either of us engineering it, into two people who no longer fit the shapes of each other's lives. And that cannot be fixed. That can only be accepted. We didn't fight over the apartment. She stayed. The lease was in both our names, and the view had always been more hers than mine, and I was leaving in 6 weeks anyway, so there was no logic to argue against. We sorted the practical things with the specific, particular courtesy that exists between people who once deeply loved each other and are now trying their best not to add ugliness to the sadness. Bank accounts, the car, the shared subscriptions, everything handled, everything civil, everything infused with the bittersweet quality of two people being their best selves with each other at exactly the moment it no longer matters in the way it once would have. My last week in the city, I stayed at Conrad's. We ate takeaway food every night and stayed up too late, and he let me talk when I needed to talk and let me sit in silence when that was what the hour actually called for. He is the kind of friend you don't deserve, but somehow end up with anyway, and I have never been more grateful for his particular brand of steady, undramatic presence than I was that week. On the final night before my flight, I sat on his balcony and looked at the city skyline. I thought about the apartment, about the view Claire had loved, about the dinner table where we'd shared hundreds of meals, about the bedroom where I had lain awake so many nights, listening to the city breathe, quietly and persistently wondering, without ever fully facing it, when exactly this life had stopped feeling like mine. I didn't feel sorry for myself that night. I want to be precise about that, because it matters. There is a meaningful difference between grief and self-pity. Self-pity asks why this is happening to me. Grief simply acknowledges that something real is ending, that it mattered, that it is over now, and that both of those facts can coexist without either canceling the other. I was grieving. It hurt with the specific, clean sharpness of something real ending rather than something already hollow finally collapsing. And I knew, beneath the hurt, that I was moving toward the right thing. Both of those things were true simultaneously. I let them both be true. I boarded the flight on a Thursday morning. One check bag, one carry-on, my work laptop, a book I had been meaning to finish for 2 years and had carried across 3 apartments without opening. The divorce proceedings were being managed by a lawyer I had consulted before leaving. Claire had been given all the relevant documents. She had not contested anything. I don't know whether that was relief or resignation on her part. I didn't ask. I put my headphones in, leaned back in the seat, and watched the city I had lived in for over a decade disappear beneath the clouds. And for the first time in a very long time, I exhaled fully. Not with happiness, not with triumph, with completeness. The specific, whole exhale of a person who has been bracing against something for so long that they had begun to believe that bracing was just what breathing felt like. Zurich was extraordinary. I don't mean that in the postcard way, though the city was undeniably, effortlessly beautiful in ways that continued to catch me off guard. I mean extraordinary in the specific way that starting over in a completely new place can be extraordinary. Nobody knew me there. Nobody carried a version of me in their head that predated the current one. Nobody needed me to be the person I had been performing for years without quite realizing I was performing it. I was just a man who had arrived in a new city with one suitcase, a job title, and the clean, slightly terrifying freedom of a fully open field. I rented an apartment near the river. 2 rooms, simple furniture, good light through wide windows in the morning. I cooked my own meals. Learned where the best coffee was within 2 blocks of the office. Started running again. Something I had quietly let go of in the last year of the marriage. One of the many small things I had released so gradually I hadn't noticed their accumulating absence until I noticed their return. The work was demanding in exactly the right way. The kind of demanding that fills you at the end of the day rather than draining you quietly from the inside. My colleagues were sharp and interesting and had no expectations of me beyond the professional ones. I had dinners out. I had real conversations that went somewhere. I felt, week by week, like more of myself rather than incrementally less. I had not understood until I was away from it how much quiet energy I had been spending every single day in the passive monitoring of a home environment that never quite settled. That low-grade vigilance, always reading the room, always calibrating, always adjusting. I had not realized how much of me it was using until it stopped. Conrad sent me terrible puns via text 3 times a week. Every single one of them made me laugh out loud. I slept well, deeply, without the persistent undertone of alertness that had characterized my sleep for longer than I'd admitted. The absence of that undertone was its own revelation. The messages started arriving approximately 3 months after I left. The first one was brief. Just, hey, hope Zurich is treating you well. I read it on a Tuesday morning before my first meeting. I didn't respond immediately. I had developed, in those 3 months, the practice of letting things sit before acting on them, making space between the impulse and the response. It had turned out to be one of the more useful habits I'd cultivated. I let it sit for 2 days. Then I wrote back, "It's going well, thanks." Clean, accurate, a door that was neither open nor slammed. She replied within the hour, "That's good, really." I acknowledged it and returned to my day. The second message came about 2 weeks later, longer this time. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. She wanted me to know she understood, now, why I had made the choices I made. She thought I had been remarkably graceful about everything and that she hadn't fully appreciated that in the moment. I read it carefully. I noticed what it contained and what it didn't. She said she had been thinking. She said she understood. She said she appreciated my grace. But she had not said the thing that would have required the most honesty. She hadn't said she missed me in the way that costs something real to admit. Or perhaps she was approaching it in pieces, carefully, the way someone circles a thing they're not entirely sure they're allowed to want anymore. I wrote back simply, "I appreciate you saying that. I hope you're doing well." Warm enough to be kind. Contained enough to be honest about where we were now. She replied with something longer, not as a pointed remark, not with a quiet edge underneath it, as a genuine wish for a person I had loved for 6 years and would always, in some quiet and uncomplicated corner of myself, wish well for. She replied, I hope you do too. A pause. Then, I think maybe you already have. I set my phone down, looked out the window at the river. The light that afternoon was the particular thin gold that Zurich does in late autumn, the kind that catches the surface of the water in a way that still surprised me every time, even months in. There was a dinner planned that evening with a colleague named Petra. She was originally from Vienna, sharp and direct and funny in the specific way of someone who doesn't perform their humor but just produces it naturally because they find life genuinely interesting. She had no knowledge of and no interest in any version of me that came before this city, this job, this particular Tuesday afternoon by the river. She knew only who I was now. The clean slate quality of being known only as who you currently are, not who you were to someone else, not who you had been in someone else's story, is something I don't think I had the right vocabulary for before I experienced it. I got up, put on my jacket, checked the reservation time, walked out into the cold, clear, beautiful air. The specific, irreplaceable quality of being genuinely seen by someone who likes who you actually are rather than who they've decided you should be. I think that was what I had been missing for a long time, without having found the right words for the absence. I had it now. The divorce finalized 7 months after I left. I received the documents by email on a Wednesday morning. Read them. Confirmed everything was in order. Signed digitally. Sent them back within the hour. There was no ceremony to it. No significant final exchange. Just the legal conclusion of something that had been ending for much longer than the paperwork took to reflect it. I went for a long walk that evening. No destination. No music in my ears. Just the city and the cold air and the sound of my own footsteps on clean pavement. I thought about the man I had been when this story started. Standing in a kitchen doorway with a dish towel in his hands. Feeling a wall shift inside his chest. Deciding, silently, to keep reading a book he couldn't read. And I thought about who I was now. Still imperfect, still capable of missing things and loving people more than they can meet. But a man who, when faced with the clear evidence that a door was closing, had chosen not to stand in the frame waiting for it to reverse direction. A man who had taken one clear, honest look at where he was and made a decision accordingly. Quietly, without performance, without waiting for permission from the person who had already, in every meaningful way, given him all the permission he needed. She sent one more message, months after the paperwork was finalized. Just 2 lines. I heard you're doing well. I'm glad. And then, you deserve to be. I read it on a Tuesday. It was raining in that particular Zurich way, steady and gray and not unpleasant. Petra was in the kitchen making coffee, and I could hear the specific unhurried sound of her moving around in there, comfortable in the space the way only people who fully belong to a moment can be comfortable. I read Claire's message twice. I wrote back, "So do you?" And I meant it. That was the last time we spoke. The silence she mentioned, the one she said was larger than she expected. It wasn't emptiness. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a carefully constructed statement I was making from across an ocean. It was just me living, fully, quietly, without apology, in a city by a river with good morning light, doing work that used me well, loving someone who chose me without calculation. When you are actually doing that, genuinely doing it, not performing recovery for an audience, not waiting to be seen doing it. You don't have extra space in you to compose a silence for someone else's benefit. You're just present in your own life. The silence explained itself. It always does. There's a version of this story where I stayed, where I archived the email from Dale permanently and never opened it again, where I folded the Zurich offer into a drawer the way you fold away the roads you decided not to take, where I sat Claire down and said, "I heard what you said at the window, and I need us to talk about it. Really talk about it. Not the polite way we've been talking about everything lately, but the actual underneath of it. Where we went to counseling after all. Where we tried." I've thought about that version. Not with longing, exactly. More with the specific, clear-eyed curiosity of a person who knows they made the right call, but still wants to look honestly at what the other roads would have held. And here's what I think that version would have looked like. I think we would have tried. I think Claire, being who she is, thoughtful, fundamentally decent, capable of genuine effort, would have engaged with it in good faith. I think we would have had real conversations. I think some of them would have been illuminating. I think we might have stabilized. For a while. But I don't think the restlessness in her would have resolved. I don't think being chosen more visibly, more loudly, more explicitly by me would have answered the question she was actually asking herself. Because the question she was actually asking herself was not, "Does he love me enough?" The question was, "Is this the life I wanted or the life I arrived at?" And that question cannot be answered by another person's effort. It can only be answered by the person asking it, in their own time, through their own honest reckoning. I could not have given her that. Staying would only have delayed the moment when she had to sit with it herself. And I had no interest in spending another year or 2 or 3 as the reason she was postponing an honesty she owed herself. That wasn't love. That was enabling avoidance. I knew the difference. I had always known the difference. I had just been choosing not to act on it. Until the window. Until the dish towel in my hands and the wall that shifted. Until the moment I was finally too awake to keep pretending I was asleep.